Fairy Tales about Princesses by the Brothers Grimm. Snow White. It was the middle of winter, and snowflakes fell like feathers from the sky. A queen sat at her window, working on an embroidery frame made of ebony. As she worked, she gazed out at the snow. She pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. When she saw how bright and red the blood looked, she said to herself, "Oh, that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of my embroidery frame." Not long after, she had a daughter. The girl had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. She was named Snow White. After a year, the queen died. The king took another wife, a beautiful but proud woman. She could not bear being surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic mirror that would tell her who was fairest of all. She would stand before it and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all?" The mirror would answer, "You are, my lady." The queen grew jealous of Snow White and wanted to kill her. But Snow White was protected by fairies who loved her and helped her escape. Snow White lived happily ever after in the woods, far away from the queen. "You are the fairest of all," and she was happy, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke truth. Now Snow White grew prettier and prettier, and when she turned 7 years old, she was as beautiful as a day, far more so than the queen herself. One day, when the queen went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all?" it answered, "Queen, you are fair, it is true, but Snow White is fairer." This gave the queen great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy. From that hour, her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her with envy and pride, like ill weeds growing in her heart higher every day. At last she sent for the huntsman, saying, "Take the child out into the woods, so that I may never see her again. You must kill her and bring me her heart as a token." The huntsman consented and led her away. But when he drew his sword to pierce Snow White's heart, she began to weep and say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild woods and never come back." And as she was so lovely, the huntsman felt pity for her and said, "Away with you then, poor child," for he thought that the wild animals would surely devour her. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his heart, for he had spared her life. Just then a young wild boar ran by, so he caught it and killed it. Taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen as a token. She salted and cooked it, and the wicked woman ate it, thinking that Snow White was dead. Now, when the poor girl found herself alone in the woods, she felt terror, even from the leaves on the trees. She did not know what to do, so she ran over sharp stones and thorn bush. The wild beasts chased after her, but they did not harm her. She ran as long as her legs could carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a small house and went inside to rest. Everything there was small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood a small table, ready laid with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, 7 knives, forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 small beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate a little porridge and bread from each plate, and drank a drop of wine from each cup, so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another too short, but at last the seventh was quite right, and so she laid down upon it, committing herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters arrived. The house came to life. They were 7 dwarves, whose job was to dig beneath the mountains. When they lit their 7 candles, it was bright inside the little house. But something was wrong. Everything was out of place. The first dwarf said, "Who's been in my chair?" The second said, "Someone ate from my plate." The third said, "They took my loaf." The fourth said, "Tasted my porridge." The fifth said, "Used my fork." The sixth said, "Cut with my knife." The seventh said, "Drank from my cup." Then the first dwarf looked around and saw a hollow in his bed. He cried out, "Who has been in my bed?" The others ran over to check their beds. They saw little white snow lying there. Asleep, he told the others, who came running up, crying out in astonishment and holding up their 7 little candles to throw light on Snow White. "Oh goodness, oh gracious," they cried, "what a beautiful child is this!" And they were so filled with joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. The 7th dwarf slept with his comrades for an hour at a time, until the night had passed, when it was morning and Snow White woke up. She was very frightened, but the dwarves seemed quite friendly. They asked her what her name was, and she told them. Then they asked how she had come to be in their house. She related to them how her stepmother had wanted her put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had been running all day long until she had finally found their little house. One of the dwarfs said, "If you will keep our house for us, cook and wash, make the beds, sew and knit, and keep everything tidy, we will be grateful. Clean, you may stay with us, and you will lack nothing foreign." "With all my heart," said Snow White, and so she stayed and kept the house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs would go to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening they would come home, and their supper would have to be ready for them. All day long the maiden would be left alone, and the good little dwarfs would warn her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know you were here. Let no one into the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart, as she supposed, felt quite sure that she was the first and fairest. So she came to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times fairer than she was." She was very angry, for the glass always spoke truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be alive. She thought and thought how she could make an end to her, for as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would know her in this disguise. She went across the 7 mountains until she came to the house of the 7 dwarves. She knocked at the door and cried, "Fine, where's the best to sell fine wares to sell?" Snow White peeped out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman, what have you to sell?" fine wares," she answered, "laces of all colors." She held up a piece that was woven in variegated silk. I need not be afraid to let in this. A good woman thought Snow White was beautiful, and she opened the door and brought the pretty lace. What a figure you have, child, said the old woman. Come and let me lace you properly. Snow White stood up before her and let the old woman lace her with new lace. But the old woman did it so quickly and tightly that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down like dead. Now you have done being the fairest, said the old woman as she hurried away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground, without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she had been laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then she began to breathe, and little by little she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said that the old peddler woman must have been the wicked queen. They warned Snow White to be careful and not to let anyone in when they were not there. And when the wicked witch returned home, she went to the mirror and said, Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? The mirror answered as it had before, You are of beauty rare, but Snow White, who lives in the glen with the 7 dwarfs, is 1,000 times fairer. When she heard this, the witch was so surprised that all the blood drained from her heart, for she realized that Snow White was still alive. She vowed to think of a way to ruin her, and by witchcraft she created a poisoned comb. She then disguised herself as an old woman and went across the mountains to the house of the dwarfs. She knocked on the door and called out, Good wares to sell, good wares to buy. Snow White looked out the window and said, Go away, I must not let anyone in, but you are welcome to look. The witch took out the poisoned comb and held it up, and Snow White touched it. The witch laughed and said, Now you shall die, Snow White. But Snow White's friends, the dwarfs, came to her aid and saved her from the witch's evil plans. It pleased the poor girl so much that she was tempted to open the door. When the deal was made, the old woman said, Now, for once, your hair will be properly combed. Poor Snow White thought no harm would come of it, so she let the old woman do as she wished. But no sooner had the comb been put in her hair than the poison began to take effect, and the poor girl fell senseless. Now you, paragon of beauty, said the wicked woman, this is the end of you. She left, but luckily it was near evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground, they thought immediately that it was the stepmother's doing. They found the poisoned comb, and no sooner had they removed it from her hair than Snow White came back to herself. They warned her once again to be on her guard and never let anyone in again. The queen went home and stood before the mirror, saying, Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? The fairest of us all, and the looking-glass answered as before, Queen, you are of rare beauty, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times fairer when she hears the looking-glass speak. Thus she trembles and shakes with anger. Snow White shall die. Cry, though it should cost me my own life. And then she goes to a secret, lonely chamber where no one is likely to come. And there she makes a poisonous apple. It is beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who sees it must long for it. But whoever eats even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, She painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. When she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs told me." "Not all right," answered the woman. "I can easily get rid of my apples. Elsewhere I will give you a song." "No, Snow White, I dare not take anything. Are you afraid of poison?" said the woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side. I will have the white one." For the apple was so cleverly made that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple. As she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth as dead. The queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony. This time the dwarves will not be able to bring you back to life again." And when she went home and asked the looking-glass against the wall, "Who is the fairest of all?" at last it answered, "You are the fairest now of all." Then her envious heart found peace, as much as an envious heart could have. The dwarves, when they returned home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground. There was no breath coming out of her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up, but nothing poisonous could be found. They cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but all to no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained so. They laid her on a bed, and sat all 7 of them around, weeping and lamenting for 3 whole days. Then they would have buried her, but she still looked as if she were living, with her beautiful blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the dark ground." They made a coffin of clear glass, so that it could be seen from all sides. They laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was the king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out on the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch, and the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and lastly a dove. Now for a long while Snow White lay in the coffin, and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the woods and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw her on the mountain, the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it, and he read what was written in gold letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you ask for it." But the dwarfs told him that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it to me, for I cannot live without looking at Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you great honor and care, as if you were my brethren." When he spoke thus, the good little dwarfs agreed. The king's son had pity on the poor man, and gave him a coffin. He called his servants and told them to carry it on their shoulders. As they were walking, they stumbled over a bush, and the poisoned apple flew out of the man's throat. It was not long before he opened his eyes and sat up, alive and well. "Where am I?" he cried. The king's son, full of joy, answered, "You are near me." He told him all that had happened, and said he would rather have him than anything in the world. "Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride," he said. Snow White agreed and went with him. Their wedding was held with pomp and great splendor. But Snow White's stepmother, jealous of her beauty, also attended the feast. When she looked in the mirror, she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You, my dear, are the fairest." The looking-glass replied, "O Queen, although you are very beautiful, the young bride is 1,000 times fairer than you." She railed and cursed, and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. At first she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt that she should not have peace until she saw the bride. When she saw the bride, she recognized her as Snow White, and could not move from the spot. Anger and terror overcame her, for iron slippers had already been placed on the fire, and they were brought to her with tongues, and set before her. The queen was forced to put the slippers on and dance until she fell down dead. The Sleeping Beauty. A long time ago there was a king and a queen who wished for a child. They tried to have one, but it never happened. One day, while the queen was taking a bath, a frog came out of the water and said that her wish would be fulfilled. Before a year had passed, she would have a daughter. The queen had a beautiful little girl. The king was so happy that he ordered a great feast to celebrate. He invited not only his friends and acquaintances, but also the wise women, in order to make sure that they were kind and well-disposed towards the child. There were 13 wise women in the kingdom, but the king had only 12 golden plates for them to eat from. One of them had to stay at home. The feast was held in great splendor, and when it ended, the wise women bestowed magical gifts upon the child. One gave her virtue, another gave her beauty, and a third gave her wisdom. When the 12th prince had made his promises, suddenly the 13th prince came in. He wished to avenge himself for not being invited, and without even greeting or looking at anyone, he cried with a loud voice. The king's daughter, who was in her 15th year, pricked herself with a spindle and fell down dead. Without saying another word, she turned around and left the room. Everyone was shocked, but the 12th, whose good wish had still remained unspoken, came forward and said that it would not be death, but a deep sleep of 100 years, into which the princess would fall. The king, who loved his dear child, gave orders that every spindle in the kingdom should be burnt. Meanwhile, the gifts of the wise women were abundantly fulfilled on the young girl, for she was beautiful, modest, good-natured, and wise. I saw her, and I knew I would love her. It so happened that on the same day when she was 15 years old, the king and queen were away from home, and the princess was left in the palace all alone. So she went around and looked into all kinds of places, rooms, and chambers as she pleased, and finally came to an old tower. She climbed up a narrow, winding staircase and reached a small door. A rusty key was in the lock, and when she turned it, the door opened. There, in a small room, sat an old woman spinning flax with a spindle. "Good day, old lady," said the king's daughter. "What are you doing here?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, nodding her head. "What is that thing that rattles so merrily?" asked the girl, taking the spindle in her hands. But scarcely had she touched it when the magic spell was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger on it. The moment she felt the pain, she fell onto the bed and fell into a deep sleep. This sleep spread throughout the palace, including the king and queen, who had just returned home and entered the great hall. They began to fall asleep, as did the entire court, including the horses in the stable, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, and even the flies on the walls. The fire on the hearth became quiet and asleep, and the roast meat stopped sizzling. The cook, who was about to scold the scullery boy for forgetting something, let him go and fell asleep. The wind stopped blowing, and not a leaf stirred on the trees surrounding the castle. However, a hedge of thorn grew around the castle, becoming higher each year. It eventually grew so high that it surrounded the entire castle, hiding it from view, including the flag on the roof. The story of the beautiful sleeping briar rose went about the country, so that from time to time kings' sons came and tried to get through the thorny hedge to the castle, but they found it impossible, for the thorns held fast together, as if they had hands, and the young men were caught in them, unable to get loose again, and died a miserable death. After many long years, a king's son came to that country again, and heard an old man talking about the thorn hedge, and that a castle was said to be standing behind it, in which a wonderfully beautiful princess named Briar Rose was asleep for 100 years, and that the king and queen and all the court were also asleep. He had heard from his grandfather that many kings' sons had already come and tried to get through the hedge, but had remained stuck in it and died a pitiful death. Then the young man said, "I am not afraid. I will go and see this beautiful Briar Rose." The good old man tried to dissuade him, but he did not listen. By this time 100 years had passed, and the time had come for Briar Rose to wake up again. When the king's son approached the thorn hedge, it was nothing but beautiful flowers that parted to let him through, and then closed behind him like a hedge. In the castle yard he saw horses and dogs sleeping, and pigeons sitting on the roof with their heads under their wings. When he entered the house, flies were sleeping on the wall, and the cook was still reaching out to grab the boy, while the maid was sitting beside a black hen that he was about to pluck. He continued walking, and in the great hall he saw the entire court lying asleep, with the king and queen lying by the throne. He continued still further and saw everything. They were so quiet that you could hear a breath. Finally he arrived at the tower and opened the door to the small room where Briar Rose was asleep. She lay there so beautifully that he couldn't take his eyes off her. He stooped down and gave her a kiss, but as soon as he did, Briar Rose opened her eyes and woke up, looking at him sweetly. Then they went downstairs together, and the king, queen, and court looked at each other in surprise. The horses in the yard stood up and shook themselves. The hounds jumped and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof pulled their heads out from under their wings, looked around, and flew off into the open country. The fire in the kitchen flickered and burned, cooking the meat. The joint began to turn again, and the cook gave the boy a box on the ear, making him scream while the maid plucked a fowl ready for the spit. And then the wedding of the king's son to Briar Rose was celebrated in great splendor. They lived happily until the end of their days. Cinderella. Cinderella, the daughter of a wealthy man, became ill, and feeling her death approaching, called her daughter to her side. She told her to be good and pious, and she would always be protected by God and watched over from heaven. After she closed her eyes, the girl went to her mother's grave every day and wept, remaining good and pious. When winter came, snow covered the grave, but when spring arrived, the man took another wife. She brought 2 daughters with her, who were beautiful but wicked. The new stepmother and her daughters began to mistreat the stepchild, taking away her pretty clothes and giving her old, gray ones. They also forced her to work in the kitchen. To the young girl they said, "He who wants to eat must earn it." They made her wear old wooden shoes and a gray dress. "Just look at the proud princess, how decked out she is." They cried and laughed, and led her into the kitchen, where she had to do hard work from morning till night. Get up before daybreak, carry water, light fires, cook, and wash. Besides this, the sisters did every imaginable injury to her. They mocked her and emptied her pea and lentil into the ashes, so that she was forced to pick them out again in the evening, when she had worked until she was weary. She had no bed to go to, but had to sleep by the fireside in the ashes. As a result, she always looked dusty and dirty. They called her Cinderella, fireside in the ashes. As a result, she always looked dusty and dirty. They called her Cinderella. It happened that the father was going to the fair. He asked his 2 stepdaughters what they wanted him to bring back for them. "Beautiful dresses," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the second. And Cinderella said, "Father, break off the first branch that knocks against your hat on your way home for me." So the father bought beautiful dresses, pearls, and jewels for his 2 stepdaughters. On his way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel branch brushed against him and knocked off his hat. He then broke off the branch and brought it with him. When he reached home, he gave his stepdaughters the things they had wished for. To Cinderella, he gave the hazel branch. Cinderella thanked him and went to her mother's grave, where she planted the branch. She watered it with her tears, and it grew into a beautiful tree. 3 times a day Cinderella would go and sit beneath it and weep and pray. A little white bird would always come to the tree, and if Cinderella wished for something, the bird would throw it down to her. However, the king had announced a festival that would last 3 days, and all the beautiful young women in the kingdom were invited. They were invited so that their son could choose a bride. When the 2 stepsisters heard that they were also to be among the candidates, they were delighted. They called Cinderella and asked her to brush their hair and fasten their buckles, as they were going to the festival in the king's palace. Cinderella did as she was told, but she was sad because she also wanted to go to the dance. She begged her stepmother to let her go. The stepmother said that she was too dirty and had no clothes or shoes, and she should not go to the festival. However, Cinderella continued to ask, and finally her stepmother agreed. If she picked out a dish of lentils from the ashes in 2 hours, she could go with them. The maiden went out the back door and called to the birds, asking them to help her pick out the good lentils and put them in a pot. The bad lentils were put in a crop. Then 2 white pigeons flew in through the kitchen window, followed by the turtle doves, and finally all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in. They were delighted amongst the ashes, and the pigeons nodded their heads and began to pick, pick, pick. The rest also began to pick, and gathered all the good grains into a dish. Hardly had 1 hour passed before they had finished, and all flew out again. Then the girl took the dish to her stepmother and was happy, believing that now she would be allowed to go to the festival with them. However, the stepmother said, "Cinderella, you have no clothes and you can't dance. You would only be laughed at." As Cinderella wept, the stepmother said, "If you can pick 2 dishes of lentils out of the ashes in 1 hour, you shall go with us." She thought to herself, "I most certainly cannot do this." When the stepmother emptied the 2 dishes of lentils among the ashes, the maiden went through the back door into the garden and saw the tame pigeons and turtle doves and all the birds under heaven. She asked them to help her pick the good seeds into a pot and the bad seeds into the crop. 2 white pigeons flew in through the kitchen window, followed by the turtle doves. Soon all the birds from the sky arrived, whirring and crowding in. They settled amongst the ashes, and the doves began to pick, nodding their heads. The others joined in, gathering all the good seeds in the dishes. Before half an hour had passed, they had finished, and all flew back out again. The maiden carried the dishes to her stepmother, delighted, believing that she could now go to the festival with them. But her stepmother said, "All this will not help you. You cannot go with us, for you have no clothes and can't dance. We would be ashamed of you." She turned her back and left. Cinderella hurried away with her 2 proud daughters, as no one was at home. She went to her mother's gravesite beneath the hazel tree and wept, shivering and quivering. The little tree shook, and silver and gold coins fell down on her. Then a bird threw a golden and silver dress down to her, and embroidered slippers with silk and silver. She put on the dress in all haste, and went to the festival. Her stepsisters and stepmother did not recognize her, thinking she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. They never once thought of Cinderella, and believed she was sitting at home picking lentils out of the ashes. The prince went to meet her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. He would dance with no other maidens, and never let go of her hand, and if anyone else approached to invite her, he said, "This is my partner." They danced till evening, and then she wished to go home. But the king's son said, "I will go with you and keep you company, for I want to see who the beautiful maiden belongs to." She escaped from him, however, and jumped into the pigeon house. The king's son waited for her father to come, and then he told him that the strange maiden had jumped into the pigeon house. The old man thought, could it be Cinderella? They had to bring an axe and pickaxe so he could break the pigeon house apart, but no one was there. When they returned home, Cinderella was lying in her dirty clothes among the ashes with a dim little lamp burning on the mantelpiece. Cinderella had quickly jumped down from the pigeon's back and run to a little hazel tree. She had taken off her beautiful clothes and left them on the ground. A bird had taken them away, and she had then placed herself among the ashes in the kitchen in her gray gown. The next day, when the festival started again, she returned to the palace as a beautiful princess, and her parents and stepsisters had left. Cinderella went to the hazel tree and said, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold, throw down upon me." And then the bird dropped down a much more beautiful dress than the day before. When Cinderella appeared in the festival in this dress, everyone was amazed at her beauty. The king's son waited until she arrived, and instantly took her hand and danced with her alone. When others approached and invited her, he said, "She is my partner." When evening came, she wished to leave, and the king's son followed her, wanting to see which house she entered. But she darted away from him into the garden, where a beautiful tall tree stood with the most magnificent pear. She climbed so nimbly among the branches like a squirrel, and the king's son could not tell where she had gone. He waited until her father arrived and asked him. The stranger maiden had escaped from me, and I believe she had climbed up the pear tree, which the father thought could not be climbed. Could it be Cinderella? And had an axe been brought and the tree cut down, but no one had been on it, and when they got into the kitchen, Cinderella was lying there amongst the ashes as usual, for she had jumped down on the other side of the tree and taken the beautiful dress off the bird on the little hazel tree and put on her gray gown. On the third day, when the parents and sisters had gone away, Cinderella went once more to her mother's grave and said to the little tree, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold, throw down over me." And now the bird had thrown down to her address, which was more splendid and magnificent than any she had yet seen, and the slippers were golden. When she went to the festival in the dress, no one knew what to say for astonishment. The king's son danced with her, and if anyone invited her to dance, he said, "She is my partner." When evening came, Cinderella wanted to leave, and the king's son wanted to go with her. She escaped from him quickly, but he used a trick and caused the staircase to be covered in pitch. When she ran down, the slipper she left behind got stuck. The king's son picked it up. It was small and golden. The next morning he took it to his father and said that no one would be his wife except the woman whose foot fits the slipper. The two sisters were happy, as they had pretty feet. The eldest sister tried the shoe on, but it was too small. Her mother gave her a knife to cut her toe off so she could become queen. The maiden cut her toe off and forced the shoe on. The prince put his foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. However, they were obliged to pass a grave where two pigeons were sitting on a hazel tree and crying. The prince turned and looked at the girl's foot and saw blood streaming from it. He turned his horse around and brought the false bride back home, saying that she was not the true one. The other sister then put the shoe on. She went into her chamber and tried to get her toes into the shoe, but her heel was too large. Her mother gave her a knife and told her to cut a bit off her heel. When she became queen, she would no longer need to walk on foot. The maiden did as her mother said and forced her foot into the shoe. She swallowed the pain and continued to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. But when they passed by a hazel tree, two little pigeons were sitting on it, crying, "Turn and peep, turn and peep. There's blood in the shoe. The shoe is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." He looked down at her foot and saw how blood was running out of her shoe, staining her white stocking. He turned his horse around and took the false bride home again. "This also is not the right one," he said. "Have you no other daughter?" the man asked. The mother replied that there is still a little kitchen wench, which her late wife left behind, but she cannot possibly be the bride. The king's son wanted to send her up to him, but the mother said she was too dirty and could not show herself. The king insisted, so Cinderella was called. She first washed her hands and face clean, then went and bowed down before the king's son, who had given her the golden slipper. She sat on a stool and drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, putting it into the slipper, which fit like a glove. When she stood up, the king's son saw her face and recognized the beautiful maiden who had danced with him. He cried out that she was the true bride. The stepmother and her 2 sisters were terrified and turned pale with rage. However, he took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. As they passed a hazel tree, 2 white doves cried out, turn and peep, no blood is in the slipper. The slipper is not too small for her. The true bride rides with you." When they had cried this, the 2 doves flew down and perched on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right and one on the left, and remained there. When the wedding with the king's son was to be celebrated, the false sisters came and wanted to gain Cinderella's favor and share in her good fortune. When the betrothed couple went to church, the elder was on the right and the younger on the left. As they returned, the pigeons pecked out one of each of their eyes. Afterwards they came back again, and the pigeons pecked out the other eye. Thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness for as long as they lived. Rapunzel. There were once a man and a woman who longed in vain for a child. The woman hoped that God was about to grant her wish. They had a small window at the back of their house, from which they could see a beautiful garden full of flowers and herbs. However, it was surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to enter it, as it belonged to an enchantress with great power, and was feared by everyone. One day the woman was standing by the window, and saw a bed with the most beautiful Rapunzel plant. She longed for it and had a great desire to eat it. This desire grew stronger every day, and as she knew she could not have any, she became pale and miserable. Her husband was worried, and he asked what aileth. His dear wife replied, if he couldn't get some of Rapunzel, which was in the garden behind their house, to eat, she would die. The man who loved her thought better than letting his wife die, so he brought her some Rapunzel himself, even if it cost him what it would. In the twilight of the evening, he climbed down over the wall into the enchantress's garden. Hastily he grabbed a handful of Rapunzel and brought it to his wife. She immediately made a salad of it and ate it with great delight. However, she liked it so much, so very much, that the next day she desired it 3 times more than before. If he was to have any peace, her husband must descend into the garden once more. Therefore he let himself down again, but when he had climbed down the wall, he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How dare you," she said with an angry look, "to descend into my garden and steal my Rapunzel like a thief?" "You shall suffer for it," he answered. "Let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your Rapunzel from the window, and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not gotten some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be soft and said, "If the case is as you say, I will allow you to take away with you as much Rapunzel as you will. Only I make one condition. You must give me the child which your wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man, in his terror, consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew up into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut herself into a tower that was located in a forest. There were no stairs or doors leading to the tower, but at the very top there was a small window. When the enchantress wanted to get out, she placed herself beneath the window and cried out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair for me." Rapunzel had long, magnificent hair, fine as spun gold. When she heard the enchantress' voice, she unfastened her braids and wound them around one of the hooks of the window above. Then her hair fell down 20 feet, and the enchantress climbed up using it. After a year or two, the king's son happened to ride through the forest and pass by the tower. He heard a song that was so enchanting, he stopped and listened. It was Rapunzel, who, in her solitude, spent her time letting her sweet voice echo through the tower. The king's son wanted to climb to her and looked for a door to the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once, when he was standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress had come there and heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I will for once try my fortune," said he, and the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Immediately the hair fell down and the king's son climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man, such as her eyes had never yet beheld, came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been stirred, so much that it had given him no rest and had forced him to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear. When he asked her to marry him, she saw that he was young and handsome. She thought he would love her more than the old Lady Goddel did, and she said yes. She laid her hand in his and said she would willingly go with him, but she did not know how to get down. She asked him to bring her a skein of silk each time he came, and she would weave a ladder with it. When the ladder was ready, she would descend, and he would take her on his horse. They agreed that he should come to her every evening until the time came for her to descend. The enchantress did not notice anything about this until Rapunzel told her. Rapunzel asked the enchantress how it was that she was so much heavier to draw up for her than the young king's son was for her. The enchantress cried out, "What do I hear you say? I thought I had separated you from the world, and yet you have deceived me." In her anger, she grabbed Rapunzel's beautiful tresses and wound them twice around her left hand. With her right hand she seized a pair of scissors, and with a snap they were cut off. The lovely braids fell to the ground, and she was so cruel that she sent poor Rapunzel into a desert where she had to live in great sorrow and misery. On the same day she cast out Rapunzel, and the enchantress, in the evening, fastened the braids of hair that she had cut off to the hook of the window. When the king's son came and called out for Rapunzel, she let the hair down, but the king's son did not find Rapunzel there. Instead, the enchantress looked at him with wicked and malicious eyes. She cried mockingly, "You thought you would find your beloved, but the beautiful bird is gone, singing no longer in the nest. The cat has caught it, and will scratch out your eyes too. Rapunzel was lost to you, and you will never see her again." The king's son was overcome with pain, and in his despair he leapt from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns he fell into pierced his eyes, leaving him blind. He wandered about the forest, eating only roots and berries, and mourned over the loss of his beloved wife. After years of wandering, he came to a desert where Rapunzel and the twins, whom she had given birth to, lived in poverty. He heard a voice that seemed familiar and went towards it. When he approached, Rapunzel recognized him and wept 2 tears that wetted his eyes, restoring his sight. They returned to his kingdom, where they were joyfully welcomed. They lived happily for many years afterwards.